So we've got Mark Thomas who's going to talk about, he's going to explore some of the economic lessons from the pandemic, what we've learned about inequality and deprivation, and what we've learned about government finances and how we can do better in the future. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good evening, everybody. Very interested to hear what David said. I'm going to assume that we are within sight of the end of COVID-19. So let's say within 12 months, it will effectively be behind us now. I'm not sure that is a certain conclusion to draw, but the reason I don't want to get into exploring that is because there's another very big question that I do want to get into exploring, which is what comes next. So let's just agree for the sake of argument to assume that we are within sight of the end. And so the question for this purpose is, where will we be and how can we move forward? So I've got a few slides that I would like to share. Obviously, the virus has hit all countries hard. It's hit them hard in healthcare terms, and it's hit them hard economically, and that is particularly true for the UK. So this is probably 10 days old now, but it's a rough picture of the economic impact on the y-axis and the healthcare impact in terms of deaths per million on the x-axis. So there are 142 countries which are both in the IMF database and the statistic database, so that you can compare these two data points. And you can see that 119 of them performed better than the UK in economic terms and COVID terms. 10 of them performed better economically but worse on COVID. 10 of them performed better on COVID but worse on the economy, and 2 countries, that's Italy and Peru, performed worse than the UK on both axes. So we have, as a country, been hard hit, but it hasn't been uniform. In fact, there's a strong correlation between how hard it has hit and your financial circumstances. So this is from the ONS. So it's really the 2 right-hand bars that you want to look at, the age standardized mortality among the most deprived and among the least deprived. So you can see it's almost a factor of 2 there, that it has hit people much, much harder in health terms. But it's also probably hit them much harder in terms of livelihood as well. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around. I'm sure you've seen the FT said that, you know, the total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by 5 trillion to 13 trillion over the last 12 months, which is apparently the most dramatic surge ever recorded by Forbes. But at the same time, a lot of poorer people have struggled. And in fact, it's too early to have really good data on that for COVID, but previous pandemics have shown this pattern. So this is periods after the pandemic event, and you can see for the top 10% through to the top 40%, how quickly their incomes rose after the pandemic. But similarly for the bottom end, you can see that their incomes continue to fall. So essentially, the general rule for pandemics is, in terms of recovery, the rich do recover, but the poor don't, and the poorer you are, the less you recover. So the conclusion from that is that, you know, even assuming that the UK has a reasonably robust recovery after COVID, it's not clear that many of the most disadvantaged people in the UK will have a robust recovery. But unfortunately, even the question of whether the UK will have a robust recovery isn't obvious. So this is, the blue line is actuals, and the thick blue line, I mean. So you can see quite a long history in terms of real GDP per capita for the UK. And you can see how we have recovered, or indeed haven't really recovered, from recent crises. The global financial crisis there, you can see not only did we never get close to that trend line, the pre-global financial crisis trend line, we never even approached the same rate of growth again. And then on the bottom right, the orange line, that's the IMF's forecast for the kind of recovery they're predicting for the UK. So again, the problem is that they're not predicting even getting back onto the pre-COVID trend line, which wasn't a fantastic trend line, but they're not even predicting that. So there's a real risk that we're going to have another partial recovery. So what happens if we look forward and if we extrapolate forward? Extrapolations are not forecasts, and that's really important to point out. But if we just extrapolate those trends forward, we can get some kind of sense as to what kind of world we might be looking at in the year 2050. But to make it just a little bit more personal, rather than looking at GDP per capita, which is illustrative of the economy as a whole, but doesn't tell you anything about how it affects people, let's look at median earnings, which is, of course, what a typical person takes home in a year. So these data are based on where it says today. That actually means 2019, because obviously last year was a misleading year to look at. So in 2019, average earnings for all earners, so that's including part-time workers, was under 25,000 in the UK. By 2050, if we stuck on the pre-2010 trends, which, as we saw, weren't that fantastic, that would have risen to just under 35,000, which means that it's not giving people a life of luxury, but it's clearly, this is in real terms, so this is inflation adjusted, so it's clearly much more comfortable than today if we could project forward on the pre-2010 trends. If we could grow in the same way that the economy has grown since 2010, so that's post-2010 growth, but fixed inequality, then it would be just under 30,000, so still a bit better. But with the post-2010 growth and the trends that we've had post-2010 inequality, then it would be under 20,000. And that's clearly a big hit, if you imagine that. That's a real terms hit of about 20%, coming off an already far from generous amount to live on. So you can start to imagine the kind of hardships that would mean in practice. But of course, we saw the trends for the economy. It is quite possible that our recovery won't be very good. We've got the post-COVID issue, we've got Brexit, which is obviously a drag on the economy, and there's a risk that we compound it with semi-permanent austerity. And if we did that, we might be looking at something a little bit over 16,000. And that's actually not very far away from today's poverty line. So if, depending on which of these happens, we could have a world in 2050 where the normal person is not having a life of luxury, but substantially more comfortable than today. Or we could be looking at a world where the UK is a bit more like South Africa than it is like today. So we would have a small, very, very wealthy elite, but a lot of people living either in or not very far above poverty. So the question is, well, which of those is going to happen? And which is more likely? Well, it actually depends on political choices and leadership. If we had somebody like Franklin D. Roosevelt in charge, or Clement Attlee, they'd be responding to this challenge with some form of New Deal, a massive investment program, and they'd be heading towards the left hand of those four pale blue bars. So Roosevelt's New Deal, that saw enormous public spending, infrastructure investments, lots of job creation schemes, huge investments in education, and a reshaping of the tax system and tackling of monopolies in the state. So it was a whole new social contract, and it was very successful. It greatly improved the lot of the typical person in the States. After the Second World War, Clement Attlee implemented the Beveridge Report, and that meant creating the welfare state and the NHS. But it also ushered in the golden age of capitalism, which in fact, is the most successful period at least in the last 800 years of the UK's economic history. So if we had a leader like that, we would be looking at this sort of left-hand scenario. But it is perfectly plausible, as we saw from the other graph, that we end up with something much more like the right-hand scenario. So on the face of it, that choice is a no-brainer. Why don't we just choose some kind of New Deal and invest to build a better UK, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren? Well, I think the obvious issue to raise is affordability. Of course, the virus has resulted in a significant increase in government debt. It's now around about 100% of GDP, and we're beginning to hear a lot of people saying that this is some kind of economic disaster. I read one person who said, the debts that we will have built up by the time the pandemic is over are simply too big to think about. If we don't tackle them now, the cost of servicing the debt is going to rise. The government will be, for the first time in history, at some risk of default. And even if that doesn't happen, then it's going to leave a huge burden on future generations. One person said, after all, it's not us that will have to pay this money back. It's our unborn grandchildren who bear no responsibility for this mess whatsoever. So in essence, what those voices are saying is, well, we may not like it, but there isn't really a responsible alternative to further austerity. Well, fortunately, that is economic nonsense. So this is a picture for the last 300 years of government debt to GDP. This is only one of the reasons that it's nonsense, but it is quite a powerful one. So as you can see, 100% is almost exactly the average level of debt that the UK has had over the last 300 years. So if all the headlines were squealing UK debt rises towards 300-year average, of course, it doesn't have quite the same emotive force. But when people show you just the tiny right-hand part of that chart without showing you the history, it does look scary. But the truth is, it's not high. It's not staggeringly high. It's not even quite average. So there's no reason at all, no rational reason for panicking. But even more strikingly, actually, even if it were a long way above, there'd still be no reason to panic. If you look at 1820, which was just about the time that the Industrial Revolution really started to take off, you can see it was over 200% then. And at the end of the Second World War, it was over 250%. But the Industrial Revolution and the golden age of capitalism, those are the two most successful periods in our economic history. The very high debt wasn't an obstacle for growth. And of course, fast growth reduces the ratio of debt to GDP. So I do think we're going to continue to hear a lot of noise about ruinous levels of debt and this rather ludicrous idea of balancing the books. But almost all of that is going to come from politicians and journalists, and virtually none of that is going to come from economists in reputable universities. So this is one of the reasons why that is. So what this chart shows really most importantly is that we have a choice. Those four bars that we were looking at before, we do have a choice as to which one we go to. And that's really good news, of course. And the other bit of good news is that actually choosing the right-hand bar does require us to make some changes, but it doesn't require us to do anything which is particularly difficult or particularly radical or particularly complex. In fact, there are just 5 things that we need to do, 5 actions we need to take. The first one is a democratic reset, a constitutional reform. So at the moment, we have an unwritten constitution. There's nothing in it which prevents the government from enacting a policy that it knows would be harmful for 99% of the population. We've always simply taken it for granted that they would never do that, but the last 10 years have demonstrated to us that we can't rely on taking it for granted. We need constitutional protection. And I think it's also become much clearer recently how much more we need in the way of checks and balances. Looking at the US under Trump, you could see how fragile democracy was. There was a real possibility of America ceasing to be a functioning democracy at all. And I think all countries need to learn from that. In the UK, this government has been challenged a lot by the legal profession, actually, and has been found to be acting illegally in all sorts of ways. We need a bit more teeth in checks and balances. The second action is perhaps even more self-evident, which is that we should base policies on facts, not myths. So austerity has been the dominant policy for the last 10 years, and it's had very profound effects. But it was justified on this idea that there was no alternative, that the state of government finances dictated it. And that was a myth. So we had our single most dominant policy based on myth. The third one is saying, based on those two, on the foundation of those two, we should then be in a position where we can formulate policy for abundance and solidarity. We can look to grow the pie, but we can also look to share it fairly so that everybody gets a decent slice of it. Now, of course, policy formulation is very complex. Any individual policy needs a great deal of thought. But actually, there are only 4 kinds of policy. Every policy either grows the pie or it doesn't grow the pie, and it either shares it fairly or it doesn't. So that gives us a picture that looks a bit like this one. On the top right, you've got shared growth policies, which are things which both grow the pie and share it fairly. So things like investment in research and development, something which has been very lacking in the UK, actually for more than 10 years, but particularly in the last 10 years, infrastructure, education, healthcare, all of those things. If we invest in those, it's good for the whole economy, but it's also good for almost everybody in the economy. You can also have captured growth policies, things which do grow the economy, but they create casualties. So if you think about widespread automation, very aggressive automation, that could be good for the economy because it could enable us to produce vastly more in the way of goods and services than we do today with the same number of people or fewer people. But it would also probably produce casualties because you would probably have a lot of people put out of work by that automation. And that brings us to the need for the type 4 policies on the bottom right, which are the balancing policies. So if we had very aggressive automation, what would we need to do? Well, we would need job creation schemes, we would need retraining schemes. We might also need to improve the benefit system, strengthen the safety net so that those people didn't suffer unduly. But the key point there is that a well-constructed policy portfolio is a balanced portfolio. It doesn't just have type 1 policies in it. If it has a type 1 policy, they need to be balanced. And finally, bottom left are the vulture policies, which are policies that neither grow the pie nor share it fairly. So if you take a hard Brexit, the government's own analysis said a hard Brexit would harm the economy, would shrink the pie. Now, if you shrink the pie, somebody's slice has to shrink. So, and in fact, the way that it has turned out is, certain hedge fund managers will do quite well out of a hard Brexit. A lot of other people won't. So that's an example of a vulture policy. So the ideal thing is we want a lot more in the way of those shared growth policies, and we really just want to cut out the vulture policies. So that's the third step. So we looked at those 3. The fourth one is very simple. We just need to invest wisely in the future. We have been underinvesting at least for 10 years, but actually probably for quite a lot more than that. And so there's a lot of catching up to do. And the fifth one is about ensuring clean, competitive markets. So there's a sort of conventional story about the way that business works and competition works, which says if you behave well in business, you will be rewarded for it. So if you treat your customers fairly, they will reward you by enhanced loyalty, and that's good for shareholder value creation. If you treat your employees fairly, they will more than repay that with their commitment and creativity and ideas. And if you contribute to the rest of society, then you'll be rewarded as a good corporate citizen. And there are certainly examples of companies which have followed that formula and been successful. But if we just look at, take the States, who are the 5 most successful companies in the States? Well, it's Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And they make up, between them, 20% of the entire S&P 500. But all 5 of those are under investigation for antitrust violations, anti-competitive behavior. They all avoid their taxes. Amazon's notorious for the way that it treats its staff. And Facebook, as we know, has been complicit in abuses of democracy. So what's really happening here? Well, unfortunately, in practice, one of the easiest ways to boost profits is to externalize your costs. If you can find a way to get the rest of society to pay some of your costs, you get a cost advantage over the ethical businesses. So let's say Daljit and I are both running a business in the same sector, but Daljit, being a model citizen, pays his staff a living wage, he pays his graduates enough that they can refund their student loans, he pays all his taxes, and he's carbon neutral. But I do none of those things. I don't pay a living wage. I've still got living workers, but either the bank of mum and dad or in some other way, the rest of society is paying the difference to keep them alive. I don't pay my taxes. I still drive on the roads and everything, but I don't pay my taxes. And I pollute left, right, and center, but I don't clean up. I'll have a cost advantage over Daljit's business. And if nothing is done to stop it, my business will, in the end, be able to destroy Daljit's business. And that's the opposite of the way that business is meant to work. It's meant to be that the ethical businesses will outcompete the bad ones. So at the moment, the playing field is tilted against ethical businesses. We need to find ways of leveling it. So those are the 5 key actions. So in 2019, I wrote this book, 99%, which was setting out in much more detail than I've done just now, these arguments. And knowing that books on their own never change anything, I thought that I should, with some friends, set up the 99% organization, which is aiming to push these ideas forward and to drive those changes, in particular those 5 actions that we've talked about. So that was an organization of about 4 or 5 people in 2019. It's now about 1,250 people, all of whom are volunteers. And so we need more volunteers. We need your help. So if any of what I've said resonates, please do join us. Please sign up and take part. And I'm very happy if there are any questions to take them now.
And Daljit, Rohit here.
Yeah.
Until all the colonies were getting independence, I don't see how, Britain really flourished tremendously in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century up to a time, which is not reflected here.
Well, the data that I showed doesn't go back that far, so you're correct. It's not reflected. The single most successful period in UK economic history was after the Second World War, which was a period where, as you know, the process was a process of decolonization rather than colonization.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting. I have a few things I agree with you on, and quite a few things I disagree with you on. I was interested, I hadn't seen that debt graph before because I'm a subscriber to the debt myth, as you call it. And it did occur to me on looking at it that the periods of high debt are either periods when Britain was the world hegemon or at war, or in the case of the early 19th century, both at once. And, those are exceptional circumstances. Those aren't normal running the economy circumstances. And you just said that the economy had its most successful period after the Second World War,
Yes.
Which was after a period of austerity, and they brought debt down dramatically after the war. And my point on debt really is you've got to have a low starting point. If you want to spend all this money, you can't start from 100% and spend a lot of money. You've got to start from somewhere lower than that.
Why do you say that?
Because eventually, well, there are 2 things which happen with debt. If you're not the hegemon, if you don't have the exceptional,
Exorbitant privilege.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And one is, we need to borrow the money. And so, the lenders won't lend us it if we're a bad credit risk. And secondly, a linked point is interest rates. We have to pay an awful lot is wasted money paying interest on debt.
Yeah, well, I used to believe all those things that you've just said, actually. So, and I think many people do, because we hear those kinds of arguments so often. I believed all of that myself. First of all, I believed 100% was high. Secondly, I believed that the government has to borrow. Now, if you look at the last 10 years, of course, you can see very quickly on the Bank of England website that the Bank of England has created. Since 1971, we've been absolutely in a fiat currency system where the government can just create money. It does it through the agency of the Bank of England. So in the last 10 years, it's created £895 billion of money. And it's used that to buy government debt. So of that 100% of GDP, almost half of it is money that the government owes to the Bank of England, which is part of the government. So this is completely different from a household which can't create money and borrow from itself. It has to go and borrow from outside. And therefore, some of the other things that you believe and I used to believe are also not true. You remember one of the justifications for austerity was that we couldn't afford to lose our AAA credit rating because borrowing costs would shoot through the roof. Well, of course, we duly did lose our AAA credit rating, and borrowing costs continued to fall. The reason for that is precisely because we live in a fiat currency system. We have our own banks. We're not like Italy or Greece, which can get some of what you say would be true if we were Italy. But we're not. We have our own central bank. We are in a fiat currency system. We can create money. So there isn't actually money itself is not the shortage. You can print money. What you can't print is people, factories, new formulae. So there are some real constraints on how fast you can grow the economy, but there are not financial constraints.
So this is the magic money tree. You don't think that there's some end to this where we keep on buying our own debt and funding ourselves? I mean, if that's the case, then why have we ever bothered with taxation?
Well, that is a good question. I think when you're under the gold standard, then it's different, because obviously if you're under the gold standard, you can't print gold, and therefore your stock of money is related to your ability to take money in, and taxes do genuinely fund spending. I think what's happened is that governments, by and large, have continued up until the global financial crisis. They continued to run as if we were on a gold standard, and that's why you keep hearing them talk about balanced budgets and so on. But in reality, we're not still on the gold standard. And they all discovered when they really needed it. You made a good point about exceptional circumstances. The global financial crisis, of course, was an exceptional circumstance. If they hadn't managed to create a lot of extra money, the banking system might have collapsed. Same in the States, of course. And so they suddenly realized, well, now this is an emergency, we're going to create the money. And they did it. We're in another emergency. This global pandemic is another exceptional circumstance.
So we don't need to tax anymore. We'll just count on the Bank of England buying the debt, shall we?
Well, we might at some point want to tax more if there are two reasons for taxing. The taxing obviously takes money out of the economy. And if the economy was overheating, then you might want to take money out in order to control inflation. If you've got rapidly rising inequality to the extent that it's destroying the fabric of society, then taxation is a way of rebalancing that. So there are some very sound reasons why you might want to tax, but neither of those reasons is simply that you need the money.
Good. Keith, you got another question
for Mark Dalton, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Mark, what do your volunteers do? You grew from 4 to 1,250 very rapidly.
Yeah, no, I'm
interested to know what do you guys actually do?
So we've got 6 projects going on at the moment. I mean, our ultimate objective is to change government policy. So there are 650 people we need to reach who are our MPs. And ultimately, all of our projects, almost all of our projects, are aiming at that. So we have one project which is directly forming links with MPs and trying to share this kind of thinking with them, which so far has been mainly working through the all-party parliamentary groups, because we're not party political. So by going through the all-party groups, we make certain that it's not party political. We've got one which is about local action. So ideally, we would like to have a little group in each constituency in the country, so that by the time of the next election, then see, somebody asked another question on tax, which I'll try and remember to come back to afterwards, so that we can influence candidates at the point of the next election. We've got one which is, I talked about this problem of externalization. So we've got one which is about effectively trying to re-engineer the profit motive. So if you knew how to calculate the value of those externalized costs, you could restate the accounts and you would be able to say, well, of Amazon's whatever it is of profit, actually 60% of it is a kind of involuntary subsidy from the rest of society, because nobody agreed they weren't going to pay a minimum wage. Nobody agreed they were going to avoid all these taxes. You add it all up, it comes to this. And now we can see how much of it is true profit and how much isn't. And that's going to be a very long, slow process, possibly the slowest of all, but it is a very powerful thing if you can do that, because the profit motive is clearly such an important driver of business behavior. We've got one, I talked about the year 2050, which is an important year, and I hope to be around to see it, but I will not be in the first flashes of youth in the year 2050, but my children will be, and if they have children, they will be. So it's their world rather than ours. So we've got one project which is looking at energizing and actually empowering what has become a slightly disaffected generation. A lot of people of that age don't vote. They didn't vote in Brexit. If they'd voted in the same proportion as the over 75s, we would still be in the EU today, which is a bit of a staggering thought. So we've got one project which is working with them. I said that most of them are about top-down policy change. One of them is not. One of them is about bottom-up change. So we've taken one particular region, which is the county of Herefordshire. And the question the project is exploring is, well, what could we do if that county, the business community, the council, the education sector, the third sector, all worked together with a shared vision and tried to build a county that was more prosperous, greener and fairer by 2030. So this is Herefordshire 2030, that project. How far could they go? And that's being a really interesting project. And what else have I forgotten? I've forgotten one, but they're all on the website. You can look on the website and see all the projects.
Thank you for that.
About whether tax takes money out of the economy. Well, yes, it does. Typically, the implication in the question was that the same amount gets spent. Actually, typically a little bit more gets spent. Otherwise, governments would always be running balanced budgets. And so the one way to think about it is, when you tax, you take money out. When you spend, you put money in. And the difference is the amount of extra money that has been injected into the economy. So if the government runs a deficit, it's actually injecting a bit of extra money into the economy. If it runs a surplus, it's taking money out of the economy.
Mark, thank you for continue with this. We want to continue with this discussion. I know that Richard just raised the question about unethical and ethical business. Richard's not an expert on either of those, but I will let Richard. Richard, do you want to ask the question?
I guess I was a bit stung by your comment that unethical businesses win and ethical businesses don't, because it's certainly not my experience in the last few years running a business and being involved in business. The ESG reporting, the environmental compliance, the everything else, it's a huge issue at the moment. It's a huge focus. And every business I've been involved in has had to show that it is performing ethically and it is doing the right things in terms of diversity and environment and everything else. And we are constantly trying to improve our practices in that at the moment. And I think there is a great deal of evidence that businesses that are performing well ethically can borrow more cheaply and can attract investors where others can't. So it seemed a very sweeping statement.
Yeah, I think it was probably a sweeping statement, because it's clearly not true that all unethical businesses perform better than all ethical businesses. That's clearly not the case. And I agree with you. There's been a lot of work, actually over the last 30 years, to try to help businesses behave more ethically. So in the UK, for example, the RSA set up this thing called Tomorrow's Company about 30 years ago. I don't know if you remember that, where they got together CEOs of progressive-minded CEOs of big UK businesses, and they all promised to behave nicely. And they did up to a point until their profit was under too much pressure. And that was really the first way of getting people together and promising to be nice. And that's wave one is still alive. So last year, I think it was 180 CEOs in America, the American Roundtable, signed pledges that said they were no longer going to have shareholder value as the prime goal of their business. They were going to look after the interests of all stakeholders. And you know, I think most business people want to behave ethically. The problem is that, for example, in the States, as I understand it, you have a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value at the moment. And you certainly can get the sack if you don't maximize shareholder value. And I think one of those 180 CEOs has already got the sack for not maximizing shareholder value. So it is very difficult for them. Wave two also has been going on for quite a long time, which is which you mentioned, Richard, which is disclosure. And perhaps, I don't know if this was the first, but the triple bottom line that John Elkington came up with, that was 20 to 30 years ago. And he was saying, you know, we shouldn't have one single P&L that companies manage by. We should have three. We should have a social responsibility, and we should have environmental responsibility as well as financial performance. We should have a triple bottom line. So that was wave two, and wave two is also still going on. So as you say, there's increased emphasis on disclosure. This project that I talked about, our externalization project, we kicked it off jointly with something called the Impact Management Project and with Imperial College. The Impact Management Project you may know about. They are the body that is coordinating the international accounting standards setters on this disclosure. So that's wave two, and they've made very good progress. They're hoping to disband themselves at the end of this year. With job done on wave two. And what we're really focusing on is wave three, which is trying to get it built into the P&L on the basis that that is the most fundamental driver of corporate behavior. And, you know, that's how CEOs get rewarded, etc. And so there are not that many people working on wave three, but Harvard has done some fantastic work in that space. There's something called the Capitals Coalition, which you may be aware of, which is working in that space. So we're trying to work with those others to push forward wave three in particular.
Well, I am very optimistic about this. I mean, your presentation was very sort of stark and I may say, a bit gloomy about these things, but I think if you're in business now, being ethical is good business.
Well,
Being
increasingly, I hope it will be. Yeah.
Well, it's very difficult to borrow money these days without having being able to get through their reputational risk committees and everything else.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very strong move, and I think also if you look politically, it is almost impossible to be a successful political party in the UK without having green policies and that sort of thing, increasingly. And I think that's I have a more positive outlook as to the way the economy is going to develop and way the green policies are going to develop, and the way they sort of look after the disadvantaged in the UK as well.
So
Well,
Richard,
I have a
that's
positive
because you were
outlook.
born in God's own country.
Yeah, no, I have a positive outlook, but I think we're going to have to fight for it. I don't think all those things will happen automatically. I don't think this country is yet, this government has yet demonstrated a genuine commitment to green policies. And I don't think it's yet demonstrated a real commitment. It talks all the time about levelling up, but as the FT pointed out, the way it allocates the levelling up funds looks pretty blatant. It's not really a levelling up fund at all. So I'm very optimistic, but I'm not so optimistic that I think I can afford to just sit back and watch it happen. I think it's really going to take us fighting for it.
I would agree with you, Mark, and Richard. I also agree with your optimism. But the comment you made about this government, we just have to look at, as a developed nation, at some of the developing countries and how they really stitch ESG policies into everything they do now. With the developing countries, and virtually every member of the United Nations signed up to the 2030 Charter, and they're all going to fail spectacularly in meeting the Charter goals and the objectives. And 2030 is not that far away. It's only about 9
years. It's no time away, actually.
And so you look at the developing countries, and we can certainly take a leaf out of their books, especially in the Western world and in the developed countries.
I certainly agree with you. We've got a long way to go, so I'm not suggesting that we're great and Mark's wrong or anything like that. I agree.
No, absolutely. But I think it has to start.
I feel the pressure, and I feel a very positive.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be gloomy, but I have. If I don't state the problem, then nobody's motivated to solve it. So I do have to be a bit stark in stating how high I think the stakes are.
So, well, I think we just have to look at some of the examples of some of the transactions that I'm sure people like Daljit see on a day-to-day basis. How many of those business plans actually major on some of these, what you call the second line and the third line on the P&L? They're all talking about the EBITDAs and the improvement and the growth and all of that. How many of them actually say, hey, we're going to be better? Because there aren't also any benchmarks. Who do you benchmark if you're in a widget manufacturing industry? Who do you benchmark yourself against and say, I'm better than? How does Amazon, as you rightly said, if Amazon was forced to start reporting on some of these things, then you might be able to compare their performance vis-a-vis someone else. One example, I'm sure there are many good examples, but one example that I've come across in recent times is Danone. Danone take it very, very seriously about, all the SDGs, and meeting those goals. And it has become very much part of their fabric. The executive team is made up with, the lead is taken by the CEO. So as you said, the CEO is going to be rewarded, not just simply by profit improvement, share price increase, but all
he was fired about 4 weeks ago.
Sorry?
The CEO was fired 4 weeks ago.
Probably was doing a good job, that's why. Sorry, I didn't.
The other issue is that there's. I was talking yesterday actually to a friend of mine who's chair of a couple of PLCs, and he was grumbling, which he's done before, and I think he's right, about the enormous discrepancy between the disclosure requirements on PLCs and those on private equity-owned businesses, where they're behind a kind of veil. So he says, here am I having to do all of this stuff. And he pointed out it's like an industry, all of this disclosure that I have to do in my businesses, and an increasing proportion of the total equity in the UK is now in the hands of private equity, which is not subject to the same constraints. So his concern with all of this is he likes the idea of what I'm talking about, but he's actually very afraid that it would make matters worse because it would only apply to PLCs, and the private equity companies would, so it would actually further create a division between the companies that are behaving ethically and those that are taking advantage of all the loot.
Mark, I think one piece of comfort I could give you is all of these guys are going to be dinosaurs.
True.
Okay, all of these guys are going to be dinosaurs because, again, going back to private equity and public companies, of which there are few and far between in developed countries, but the private equity firms operating in those developing areas are actually making this part of their business ethos. So if it's private equity and hedge funds, again, in developed nations, these guys are going to be left behind fairly soon. Maybe not in my lifetime, but their time is, I mean, the clock is ticking for these guys. So, and I think we also just have to listen to the younger generation.
Absolutely.
I mean, their behavior is totally different to, I'm showing my age now with my gray hair, totally different because for them, everything is about social.
Absolutely.
Everything is about, okay, we don't mind spending the money, but how's it made a difference to the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that there is a sea change, and the PLC chairman shouldn't lose hope. If anything, he should be the torchbearer.
Yeah.
So can I just expand upon this point about the PLC chairman? What he's overlooked is fund documents and LPs investing have a requirement for them to make sure the ESG is in the businesses they invest in.
Yeah.
And they're not allowed to invest in businesses that don't. So, for example, I'm involved in a drinks deal at the moment, and certain of the funds won't invest in alcoholic deals at all.
Great.
That's just by example. Others will, and there's a concept of drinking less but better.
Yes.
So you can spin it that way.
Yeah.
But I think your friend is misunderstanding what's happening in private equity, because one, there's been a number of charters passed about ESG reporting standards, etc., and secondly, the burden of the LPs, who are the insurance companies, etc.
Family offices.
There, Robert's got a question. Got his hand up.
Sorry, it was more a comment than a question. I mean, going back to the benchmarking point from a few minutes ago, I'm always amazed that large organizations don't take the opportunity to use people they hire from competitors to do a pretty comprehensive benchmarking exercise. I mean, some companies pay very expensive consultants to do this for them, but a business like Danone that was mentioned, they must have a dozen senior managers and 100 middle managers who've worked for their main competitors over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's something I always find incredible because I work on the M&A staff, and on every deal I work on, my client learns something from potential purchasers they come in contact with, and vice versa.
So, Mark, that was a great talk. It was very interesting. You're going to have to come back and do it again in light of government policy. Mm-hmm. So in 6-7 months' time, we'll have greater clarity about what they're going to do to reflate, inverted commas, the UK economy. And I think if you could score them relative to your view, and equally next time you talk, I'll be interested, you used the point, if we were Italy, we couldn't do it.
Oh, yeah.
And that intrigued me, because the same analogy must therefore apply to Spain and France, etc.
Yes, well, yes, it does, because they don't have control of the central bank. So there's one European central bank. It's not inconceivable that that European central bank could do something for the whole of the Eurozone that would be equivalent. But of course, as any individual country, it's outside your control, and the dominant country I think, is probably Germany in terms of influence on the central bank. And I think, you know, we have seen Eurozone peripheral countries getting into problems they simply wouldn't have if they had their own central bank.
Okay, good. Well, look, it's Thursday, so I probably can say, hope you all have a great weekend. And we're probably going to pause now until September. I'll send an email out in the morning just confirming that, because people are clearly enjoying summer, which they should do, bearing in mind the last 16 months. And we'll line up talks for September onwards. Good. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Bye.